Good evening. Settle into a comfortable position and allow yourself to relax. Tonight, we're going to journey back to the early years of the 20th century, to a narrow strip of land in Central America, where one of history's most ambitious engineering projects took shape: the Panama Canal, a waterway that would connect two oceans and reshape global commerce and military strategy for generations to come. But this is not a story of triumph alone. It is, perhaps more accurately, a story of cost. Of the tens of thousands of men who traveled from distant islands to dig through mountains and swamps. Of the diseases that killed more workers than the work itself. Of imperial ambition, cloaked in the language of progress. Of the transformation of a landscape and the exploitation of those who made that transformation possible. We will walk through this history slowly, carefully, allowing you to imagine the heat and the rain, the sound of dynamite echoing through jungle valleys, the rhythm of labor that stretched from dawn until dusk. We will meet the workers who arrived with hope and found hardship. We will examine the political maneuvering that made the canal possible. We will explore the medical breakthroughs born of necessity. And we will consider what this narrow waterway meant for the projection of power across the globe. So breathe deeply, let the present recede, and let us begin with the daily life of a man whose labor carved a path between two great oceans. Imagine yourself standing in the pre-dawn darkness of a labor camp on the Isthmus of Panama. The year is 1907. You have traveled here from Barbados, one of more than 50,000 West Indian men who made the journey to this narrow strip of land between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. You came because you heard there was work. Steady work. The kind that might allow you to send money home, to lift your family from poverty, to build something for the future. But standing here now, in the thick tropical air before sunrise, you understand that the promise was incomplete. The work is here, certainly, but so is everything else that was left unspoken. You live in a wooden barracks that was built decades ago by the French, when they first attempted to dig this canal. The structure is weathered, the wood soft with rot in places, the roof patched with whatever materials could be found. Some men live in tents pitched in clearings carved from the jungle. Others rent rooms in the small towns that have sprouted along the construction route, if they can afford such luxury. The accommodations provided by the Canal Commission are minimal, functional only in the sense that they provide shelter from the torrential rains that sweep across the isthmus with startling regularity. The sanitation in these camps is inadequate. Latrines are poorly maintained. Water sources are questionable. The jungle presses in on all sides, dense and alive with insects. Mosquitoes descend in clouds at dusk, their whining omnipresent, their bites constant small irritations that sometimes herald something far worse. You wake when the whistle blows. You dress in clothes still damp from yesterday's sweat and rain. You eat whatever simple meal you can prepare or purchase cornmeal, salted fish, bread if you're fortunate. And then you walk or ride in one of the cramped train cars to the worksite. The Culebra Cut. This is where the vast majority of your waking hours are spent. It is a gash torn through the continental divide, a narrow valley being excavated through solid rock and unstable soil. The goal is to create a passage through the mountains, deep enough and wide enough for ships to transit between the oceans. The reality is an ongoing battle against geology itself. You are assigned to a labor gang. Your job is to dig, to clear, to carry, to drill. You operate a rock drill, the vibration traveling through your arms and shoulders, the noise deafening. Or you shovel the broken rock and earth into carts that are hauled away by narrow-gauge railroad tracks. Or you carry lumber for the construction of railway ties and bridges. The tasks are interchangeable. The common thread is that they are physically demanding, repetitive, and dangerous. The heat is oppressive. Panama sits just north of the equator, and the sun beats down with relentless intensity. By mid-morning, the temperature climbs into the 90s. The humidity is stifling, the air so thick with moisture that breathing itself feels like a labor. Sweat soaks through your clothes within the first hour. There is no respite. The workday is 10 hours long. The rain, when it comes, offers no relief. The rainy season brings daily downpours, sudden and violent. The sky darkens, and within moments the rain falls in sheets, turning the ground to thick mud, filling the excavation with water that must be pumped out before work can resume. The mud clings to your boots, to your clothes, to the tools. It makes every movement slower, every task more difficult. And then there is the dynamite. The excavation of the Culebra Cut requires blasting. Holes are drilled into the rock face. Dynamite is inserted, and then the charges are detonated, sending tons of rock and earth cascading down into the cut. You hear the blasts throughout the day, distant thunder that echoes through the valley. Sometimes the blasts are too close. Sometimes the timing is miscalculated. Men are killed in dynamite accidents with grim regularity. But the dynamite, at least, you can anticipate. The landslides are another matter entirely. The geology of the Culebra Cut is treacherous. The rock formations are unstable. Layers of porous material rest atop more solid stone, and when saturated with rainwater, they simply give way. Gravity slides occur without warning. One moment you are working at the base of the excavation, and the next a wall of mud and rock is sliding toward you. Entire work crews are buried alive. Steam shovels, the massive excavating machines that represent the pinnacle of industrial technology, are swallowed by the earth. The testimonies of these landslides are stark. Old photographs show the aftermath. Loose bills mixed with dirt and blood, evidence of the deaths that occurred moments before. The pragmatism with which the engineers approach these tragedies is chilling. The debris is cleared, the dead are counted, and the work continues. You are paid for this labor, but the wage itself is a reminder of your place in the hierarchy of the Canal Zone. The payment system is divided into two rolls, gold and silver. The gold roll is for skilled workers, almost all of whom are white Americans or Europeans. They are paid 20 cents per hour, and they receive their wages in gold coin. The silver roll is for unskilled workers, the vast majority of whom are black West Indians like yourself. You are paid 10 cents per hour, half the wage of your white counterparts, and you receive your wages in silver coin. This distinction is not merely financial. The gold and silver rolls become the basis for a comprehensive system of segregation that permeates every aspect of life in the Canal Zone. There are separate housing facilities, separate dining halls, separate schools for the children of workers, separate hospitals. Even the water fountains and the waiting areas at train stations are divided by race. The silver roll workers, regardless of whether they are West Indian or Black American citizens, experience this segregation in every interaction, every transaction, every moment of their lives in the zone. And yet, for many, the wage, meager as it is, represents an opportunity that did not exist at home. The economic desperation that drove you to make the journey to Panama is real. The promise of steady work, of being able to send money back to Barbados or Jamaica or Grenada, is powerful enough to make men accept conditions that would otherwise be unthinkable. But the cost is measured in more than money. The diseases that flourish in the tropical environment of the Isthmus are the true killers. Yellow fever and malaria. These are the names that haunt the labor camps, whispered with fear and resignation. Yellow fever arrives suddenly. One day you feel well. The next you are burning with fever. Your head pounds, your muscles ache, and then, if you are unlucky, the disease progresses to its hemorrhagic phase. You begin to bleed internally. Your skin takes on a yellowish hue, jaundice, the hallmark of the disease, the reason it was called Yellow Jack. The mortality rate is horrifying. During the French construction effort, over 85% of workers were hospitalized, and 22,000 died, primarily from yellow fever. Malaria is more insidious. It does not kill as quickly or as dramatically, but it weakens. It recurs. You contracted once, and it remains in your blood, flaring up periodically, sapping your strength, leaving you feverish and shaking. Thousands are hospitalized with malaria. It does not inspire the same terror as yellow fever, but it is a constant drain on the workforce, a constant reminder that the environment itself is hostile. Settle yourself comfortably. Let the weight of the day gently fall away. Tonight, you're invited on a quiet journey through time, back to the marble corridors and gilded chambers of Versailles, the palace that became both a masterpiece and a prison for thousands of French nobles. Imagine yourself stepping away from the present, leaving behind the ease of movement, the freedom of choice, the comfort of privacy. You are crossing centuries to enter a world where every gesture carried meaning, where standing in the correct position could secure a fortune, or a whisper in the wrong ear could end a career. This is the world of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the court he built to contain the power of France's nobility. Tonight, you will walk through the daily rhythms of court life as a minor nobleman. You will witness the great wars that bled France's treasury dry. You will uncover the curious shadow diplomacy of a later king. And you will step outside those golden walls to see the fields and hovels where millions toiled to pay for all that splendor. The contrast was stark, the beauty extreme, the cost almost unimaginable. But for now, simply relax. Let yourself drift into this vanished world and allow the steady rhythm of history to ease you toward rest. You are a minor noble, perhaps the Comte de something or other, a title inherited from your father, along with a modest estate somewhere in the provinces. The fields are productive enough, the peasants reasonably dutiful, but the income is nothing compared to what you need now, because you have come to Versailles. You arrived with trunks of clothing, letters of introduction, and hope. Your family's chateau, 3 days' ride from Paris, now feels impossibly distant, like a memory from another life. You mortgaged the estate to afford this gamble. Everything depends on being seen, on standing in the right place at the right time, on catching the king's eye. The palace is vast beyond comprehension. Marble floors stretch endlessly. Mirrors reflect chandeliers and courtiers in an infinite regress of light and color. The hall of mirrors alone feels like walking through a dream, all gleaming surfaces and painted ceilings depicting the king's triumphs. But you are not here to admire the architecture. You are here to survive, to advance, to secure some small share of royal favor that might translate into a pension, a posting, a marriage for your daughter that will save the family fortune. Your apartment is not in the grand sections of the palace. Those rooms, spacious and positioned near the king's own chambers, go to dukes, to ministers, to those already in favor. You have been assigned quarters in the upper floors, cramped and cold, accessible only by narrow servant stairs that wind upward into the attics. The ceilings slope. In winter, frost forms on the inside of the windows. In summer, the heat is stifling. You share these corridors with other minor courtiers, secretaries, lesser officials, all of you clinging to the outer edges of power. Still, you are here. And being here is everything. Your day begins in darkness. The palace stirs early, and you must be awake before dawn to prepare yourself. The clothing is crucial, impossibly so. Court fashion is elaborate, expensive, and constantly changing. You must wear silk stockings, breeches of fine fabric, coats heavy with embroidery, lace at throat and wrists. Your wig must be powdered, your shoes polished, every detail perfect. A tailor's bill from last month sits unpaid in your drawer. A merchant who supplied gloves has begun sending letters. You ignore them. Appearance is all that matters. By 7 in the morning, you make your way through the corridors toward the king's apartments. You are not alone. Dozens, then hundreds of courtiers flow in the same direction, all moving toward the same goal. Attendance at the king's lever, the ceremony of his rising. The lever is choreographed with exquisite precision. You understand that only a select few will actually enter the king's bedchamber for the earliest, most intimate stages of the ceremony. Those are reserved for princes of the blood, the highest nobility, officials who hold specific ceremonial positions. You are not among them. Instead, you wait in the antechambers, pressing as close as etiquette allows, hoping to be present when the doors open wider, when the king emerges into slightly more public view. The ritual unfolds slowly. The king's first valet de chambre enters the bedchamber at 7, precisely to wake His Majesty. A physician and surgeon attend, offering reports on the royal health. The king's wig is brought in, an object of such importance that courtiers compete for the honor of presenting it. Gradually, more people are admitted. The king washes his hands in spirits of wine. He kneels for prayers. He is dressed, piece by piece, each garment handed to him through a careful chain of precedence. You stand and watch from the doorway, or perhaps from the next room, seeing only glimpses through the crowd. What matters is that you are present. Your name might be recorded on a list. A king might glance in your direction. A minister might notice your attendance. The lever can last 2 hours. By the time it concludes, by the time the king is fully dressed and proceeds to his chapel for mass at 10 o'clock, your legs ache from standing. But you follow, joining the procession, maintaining your position in the crowd. After mass, the king conducts business, councils, meetings with ministers, audiences. You are not part of these proceedings. Instead, you join the other courtiers in the great galleries, the salons, the endless rooms where the court gathers to wait. Waiting is the primary activity at Versailles. You wait to be summoned. You wait for news. You wait for some opportunity that might never arrive. The galleries are cold despite the season, drafty despite the grandeur. You stand with others of similar rank, engaging in careful conversation. Topics must be chosen with caution. A careless word repeated by the wrong person can ruin you. Gossip flows constantly, a river of whispers about who is rising, who is falling, whose mistress has gained influence, whose pension has been revoked. You cannot afford to offend anyone, but you also cannot afford to be invisible. It is a delicate balance, requiring constant attention, constant performance. Meals present another trial. The king dines publicly, and you may be permitted to watch, standing in the designated area while His Majesty eats. Your own meals are taken where you can afford them. There are establishments near the palace where courtiers gather, ordering dishes they cannot pay for, accumulating debts that pile upon debts. You eat less than you would at home. The money must be preserved for clothing, for tips to servants who might whisper your name in useful ears, for gambling. Gambling is not optional. The king enjoys cards, and games are held regularly in the palace salons. To absent yourself would be noticed. To participate costs money you do not have. But you sit at the table, wagering carefully, losing slowly, hoping that your presence at the game might matter more than the coins you surrender. The expenses are crushing. Beyond clothing and food and gambling, there are servants to maintain, gifts to distribute, contributions expected for court festivities. Back home, your steward writes letters describing the estate's needs. Repairs neglected, harvests uncertain, creditors demanding payment. You read these letters in your cramped apartment and feel the weight of impossibility. You cannot leave Versailles to manage your lands. To leave would be to forfeit everything you've invested in being here. But staying is bleeding you dry. The paradox is inescapable. The king has made the court essential. Decades ago, the French nobility were independent powers, holding fortified estates, commanding their own followers, sometimes challenging royal authority. Louis XIV changed that. He built Versailles and filled it with spectacle, creating a space where noble status required presence. To be absent from court was to be irrelevant. To be irrelevant was to lose influence, offices, royal favor. So you stay, and so do thousands of others, all trapped in this magnificent cage. The etiquette is elaborate to the point of absurdity, yet violations are deadly serious. There are rules governing who may sit in the king's presence, who may lean against furniture, who may knock on doors versus scratching with a fingernail to request entry. Position in a procession is determined by complex hierarchies of rank. The wrong step, the wrong assumption, can lead to public humiliation. You watch and learn. You study how the dukes carry themselves, how the ministers navigate conversations, how favor is courted through gestures so subtle they are almost invisible. Every action is a calculation. Every word is weighed. Evenings bring more ceremonies. The king attends entertainments, plays, concerts, balls. You attend as well when permitted, always watching, always present. The music is beautiful. The performances, exquisite. But you experience them through the lens of strategy, wondering if your laughter at a comedy pleased the right person, if your applause was noted. The medical care available to you is primitive by any standard. There are hospitals in the Canal zone, but they are overwhelmed. The Canal Commission's 1910 report records 548 employee deaths that year alone, including 376 from disease and 164 from industrial accidents. The categories of death are grimly varied. Dynamite explosions, railroad accidents, electrocutions, drownings, and a catch-all designation of accidental traumatisms various. You watch your co-workers fall ill. You watch them weaken. You watch them die. The death toll among Korean workers is staggering. Of the 5,609 workers who died during the American construction effort, 4,290 were from the Caribbean. In 1910, 167 deaths were recorded among workers from Barbados, 113 from Jamaica, 49 from Martinique and Guadeloupe. These are not abstract statistics. These are men you knew, men who shared your barracks, men who worked beside you in the cut, and yet you continue. Each morning, the whistle blows. Each morning, you rise and walk to the work site. The rhythm of your days is dictated by the demands of the canal. The excavation must proceed. The schedule must be met. The ambitions of empire do not pause for individual suffering. You dig through mountains. You shovel mud. You drill into rock. You ride the narrow-gauge trains that carry the excavated earth away. Thousands upon thousands of cubic yards of material, removed and deposited elsewhere, reshaping the landscape itself. You work alongside steam shovels, massive machines that bite into the earth, their mechanical arms lifting tons of rock in a single scoop. You are dwarfed by the scale of the endeavor, a single human body in a vast industrial operation. At night, you return to the barracks. You eat. You rest as best you can in the humid heat. And you think, perhaps, of home, of the family waiting for the money you send, of the life you left behind, of whether you will survive long enough to return. The knowledge is always present, unspoken but undeniable. You are digging through a landscape that resists every effort. You are laboring in conditions that weaken and kill. You are building something monumental, but the monument will not bear your name. You are making American millionaires richer. You are fulfilling imperial ambitions that have nothing to do with your own hopes or dreams. And still, the work continues, day after day, month after month, year after year. The Calabre cut deepens. The canal takes shape, and the toll, measured in lives lost and bodies broken, accumulates in silence. By 1914, when the canal finally opens to shipping, the cost will be clear. 5,609 deaths during the American effort, 22,000 during the French attempt, 27,000 lives in total spent to connect two oceans. The engineering triumph is undeniable, but so is the human cost. You are one of the fortunate ones, perhaps. You survive. You return home. You carry with you the memory of those years in the jungle, the heat and the mud and the endless labor. And you carry, too, the knowledge of what was built and what was lost in the creation of that narrow channel through the isthmus. The Canal Zone, in those years, was a place where modernity and exploitation existed side by side, where industrial progress was inseparable from human suffering, where the vision of connecting two oceans required the labor of men who were seen as expendable. This was the reality of a laborer's life in Panama from 1904 to 1914, a life measured in 10-hour days, in silver wages, in the ever-present threat of disease and death, a life lived in service to an ambition that was never your own. And as you drift toward sleep, you might reflect on the contrast, on the fact that you lie in comfort and safety, while those men dug through mountains in tropical heat, knowing that each day might be their last. The canal remains. The ships still transit between the oceans. But the names of the diggers, the carriers, the drillers, those names are largely forgotten, absorbed into the larger narrative of American achievement. The story of the Panama Canal did not begin with American ambition. It began instead with French confidence. And it ended for France in catastrophic failure and scandal on a scale that shocked a generation. The vision belonged to Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and engineer who had achieved international fame for successfully completing the Suez Canal in Egypt in 1869. The Suez Canal had been an engineering triumph, a sea-level waterway that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, dramatically shortening the maritime route between Europe and Asia. De Lesseps was celebrated as a visionary, a man who had conquered geography through sheer determination and technical expertise. In May 1879, a Congress of delegates assembled in Paris to consider the possibility of a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. 136 delegates attended, including de Lesseps himself. The Congress was held in the rooms of the Société de Géographie under the presidency of Admiral de la Rancière-Lenoury, and the delegates voted in favor of the project. De Lesseps proposed a sea-level canal without locks, replicating the design that had succeeded in Suez. There were dissenting voices. Engineers who understood the fundamental differences between Panama and Egypt raised objections. The terrain was different. The geology was different. The climate was different. At Suez, the desert environment had presented its own challenges, but Panama was a jungle, dense, humid, teeming with disease. And the elevation of the continental divide meant that a sea-level canal would require cutting through a mountain range to a depth far greater than anything attempted at Suez. But de Lesseps was persuasive. He possessed an infectious enthusiasm, an exuberant confidence that captivated audiences. He dismissed the concerns of the engineers. He assured investors that the canal could be completed in 8 years. And the French public, still basking in the glory of Suez, believed him. Work began on January 1st, 1881. The Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique, the French Panama Canal Company, commenced excavation with high hopes and substantial financial backing. A public subscription had raised considerable capital. Thousands of investors, including 800,000 French citizens from all walks of life, purchased stocks and bonds in the venture. For many of these investors, the purchase represented their life savings, a bet on progress and French ingenuity. The reality on the ground in Panama quickly diverged from de Lesseps's optimistic projections. The excavation proved far more difficult than anticipated. The Culebra Cut, the section through the continental divide, was a nightmare of unstable soil and solid rock. The jungle reclaimed cleared areas with astonishing speed. The equipment rusted and broke down in the humid climate, and the workforce was decimated by disease. Yellow fever and malaria swept through the workers' camps with horrifying efficiency. The French did not understand the mechanism of disease transmission. They did not know that mosquitoes were the vectors. They implemented sanitation measures based on miasma theory, the belief that disease arose from foul air and decomposing organic matter. They placed the legs of hospital beds in bowls of water to prevent ants from climbing up and disturbing patients. They did not realize that these standing pools of water were perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. The death toll mounted steadily. Workers arrived from France, from the Caribbean, from various parts of Latin America. And they died. The mortality rate was staggering. Over the course of the French effort, an estimated 22,000 men lost their lives to disease and accidents. Yellow fever alone accounted for the majority of these deaths. The disease struck with terrifying speed, progressing from initial fever to hemorrhagic crisis to death within days. The work continued, but progress was slow. By 1889, after 8 years of effort, the canal was approximately 2/5 completed. The French had excavated about 22,600,000 cubic yards of material through the Culebra Mountains. This represented an enormous amount of physical labor and engineering effort. But it was nowhere near sufficient to complete a sea-level canal. And the money was running out. De Lesseps and the company directors continued to request additional funding from investors, even as it became clear that the project was in serious trouble. The company spent approximately $262 million over the course of its operation. In today's terms, this would represent roughly $10 billion. The expenditure was massive, and much of it was squandered on inadequate planning, inefficient operations, and corruption. On May 15, 1889, the project was suspended. Work ceased. On February 4, 1889, the Tribunal Civil de la Seine ordered the winding up of the Panama Canal Company. The company was bankrupt. The scope of the financial disaster became clear over the following years. 800,000 French investors, including 15,000 single women, had lost their money. The total loss amounted to approximately 1.8 billion gold francs. From the 9 stock issues, the company had received 1.2 billion gold francs, of which 960 million had actually been invested in Panama. The remainder had been pocketed by financiers, promoters, and corrupt politicians. The scandal that followed was one of the largest monetary corruption affairs of the 19th century. It became known as the Panama Affair. Investigations revealed that members of the French government had accepted bribes to keep quiet about the company's financial troubles. Newspapers had been paid to suppress negative coverage. Politicians had profited, while ordinary citizens lost everything. The revelations shook the Third Republic and destroyed reputations. De Lesseps himself, once a national hero, was convicted of fraud, though he never served prison time due to his advanced age. For more than a decade, the abandoned excavations and rusting equipment sat in the Panamanian jungle. The buildings deteriorated. The machinery was swallowed by vegetation. The high losses were incurred due to the damp, warm climate that corroded everything. It appeared that the dream of a canal across Panama had died with the French effort. But the strategic importance of such a canal had not diminished. If anything, it had grown more apparent. The United States, emerging as a global power at the turn of the 20th century, recognized that a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would fundamentally alter naval strategy and commercial shipping. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had demonstrated the limitations of American naval power when the battleship USS Oregon had to make a grueling voyage from San Francisco around Cape Horn to reach the Caribbean, a journey that took 67 days. A canal would reduce such voyages by thousands of miles and weeks of travel time. President Theodore Roosevelt made the acquisition and construction of a canal a priority of his administration. But there was a significant obstacle. The Isthmus of Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia was not inclined to grant the United States the terms it demanded. Negotiations between the United States and Colombia took place throughout 1903. The United States proposed the Hay-Heron Treaty, which would have granted America rights to construct and control a canal. But the Colombian Senate rejected the treaty in August 1903, finding the terms unacceptable. The proposed compensation was insufficient, and the treaty would have infringed on Colombian sovereignty. Roosevelt was not deterred. He and his advisors began exploring alternative approaches. and they found a willing collaborator in the province of Panama itself, where resentment toward the Colombian government was long-standing. Panama had long chafed under rule from Bogotá. The region had experienced numerous rebellions and declarations of independence over the preceding decades, most of which had been suppressed. The failure of the Canal Treaty presented an opportunity. If Panama could achieve independence from Colombia, it could negotiate its own treaty with the United States. The United States provided encouragement and support for this endeavor. While the extent of direct American involvement in the planning of the Panamanian Rebellion is debated by historians, the outcome was clearly favorable to American interests. On November 3, 1903, Panama declared independence from Colombia. The Colombian government attempted to suppress the rebellion by sending troops to Panama. Colombian soldiers arrived in Colon, on the Caribbean coast. But American naval vessels were already positioned off the coast. The USS Nashville was present in Panamanian waters. American forces intervened to prevent Colombian troops from crossing the isthmus. The commander of the Colombian battalion in Panama, General Huertas, was persuaded to support the rebellion rather than oppose it. Colombian officers were arrested. The Colombian troops in Colon, surrounded by American forces and threatened by the USS Nashville, were persuaded to withdraw. This intervention is often cited as a classic example of gunboat diplomacy. The presence of American military power ensured that the Panamanian Rebellion succeeded. Colombia, unable to reassert control without engaging American forces, was forced to accept the loss of its province. The newly independent Republic of Panama wasted no time in negotiating with the United States. On November 18, 1903, just 15 days after the Declaration of Independence, the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed. The Panamanian signatory was Felipe Jean Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer and lobbyist who had been involved in the original French Canal effort and who had played a role in facilitating the Panamanian independence movement. The American signatory was Secretary of State John Hay. The terms of the treaty were extraordinarily favorable to the United States. The United States agreed to pay Panama $10 million up front and an annual rental fee of $250,000. In exchange, Panama granted to the United States in perpetuity the use, occupation, and control of a zone 10 miles wide, extending 5 miles on either side of the proposed canal route. The language of the treaty was striking. The United States was granted rights, as if it were the sovereign of the canal zone. Panama retained nominal sovereignty, but the United States would exercise all governmental authority within the zone. The treaty created, in effect, an American colonial enclave cutting through the heart of Panama, and the grant was perpetual. There was no provision for eventual Panamanian control of the canal or the territory surrounding it. The treaty was controversial, even at the time. Many Panamanians felt that their newly independent nation had traded Colombian rule for American domination. The terms had been negotiated by Bunau-Varilla, a Frenchman with his own financial interests in the canal project, rather than by Panamanian representatives. But the treaty was ratified, and the United States took control of the canal zone. In 1904, the United States formally purchased the assets of the defunct French Canal Company for $40 million. This included the excavations already completed, the Panama Railroad, and the various equipment and buildings that remained. $30 million of this sum was attributed to the value of the excavation work. Primarily in the Culebra Cut, the Americans inherited 22,600,000 cubic yards of excavated material, for which they paid approximately $1 per cubic yard. The American effort began immediately, but the new administrators understood that disease control would be essential to success. The French failure had been, in large part, a medical failure. 22,000 deaths could not be ignored. If the American effort was to succeed, the epidemic diseases that had ravaged the French workforce would have to be conquered. Colonel William Crawford Gorgas was appointed as Chief Sanitary Officer of the Canal Zone. Gorgas was a U.S. Army surgeon who had already proven the effectiveness of mosquito control measures in Havana, Cuba. Following the Spanish-American War, he understood that yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes, and he knew that eliminating mosquito populations could prevent these diseases. Gorgas implemented a comprehensive sanitation campaign across the Canal zone. The measures were far-reaching and ambitious. Ponds and swamps were drained to eliminate mosquito breeding sites. Standing water was covered with oil to kill mosquito larvae. Approximately 700,000 gallons of oil and 124,000 gallons of larvicide were used over the course of the project. Buildings were fumigated to kill adult mosquitoes. Public water systems were constructed to provide clean drinking water and reduce the need for water storage that could harbor larvae. Gorgas divided the Canal Zone into districts, each with its own team of inspectors. These inspectors searched houses and buildings for mosquito larvae. If larvae were found, carpenters were dispatched to eliminate the sources of standing water. Mosquito netting was distributed and used extensively. The entire infrastructure of the Canal Zone was redesigned with disease prevention in mind. The results were dramatic. Yellow fever, which had killed thousands of French workers, was effectively eliminated from the Canal Zone by 1906. Malaria cases dropped significantly, though the disease was never entirely eradicated during the construction period. The mortality rate among workers plummeted. While 5,609 deaths still occurred during the American construction effort, a sobering number, this represented a dramatic improvement over the French experience. Gorgas's success made the completion of the canal possible. Without effective disease control, the American effort would likely have failed, just as the French effort had failed. The conquest of yellow fever and malaria in Panama was a triumph of public health and tropical medicine. But this medical triumph was inseparable from the political and military context in which it occurred. The canal was an imperial project, justified by the ideologies of the era. Theodore Roosevelt and his contemporaries believed in the destiny of Anglo-Saxon nations to civilize and develop what they viewed as backward regions. The racial theories that underpinned the gold roll and silver roll wage system were the same theories that justified American intervention in Panama and American control of the Canal Zone. Roosevelt himself was unapologetic about the methods used to acquire the canal route. He defended the instigation of Panamanian independence as a moral act, claiming that the United States had freed the Panamanian people from subjection to alien oppressors. He presented the American role as beneficent, a gift of self-government to a people who desired freedom. The fact that this freedom came with a perpetual American presence, and that the terms of that presence were extraordinarily favorable to the United States, was framed as a necessary compromise. The aggressive imperialism of the era was cloaked in the language of progress and civilization. The canal was presented as a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity, a project that would benefit all of humanity by facilitating global commerce. And these things were true, but they were not the whole truth. The canal was also an instrument of power projection, a means of enhancing American naval and commercial dominance, a physical manifestation of empire carved through a sovereign nation's territory. By 1904, the stage was set for the American construction effort. The French failure had demonstrated what would not work. The American takeover had secured the necessary territory and political control. Gorgas's sanitation measures were beginning to reduce disease, and tens of thousands of workers, primarily from the Caribbean, were arriving to provide the labor. The contrast between the French and American efforts would become a point of pride for American administrators and engineers. Where the French had failed due to inadequate planning and disease, the Americans would succeed through superior organization and medical knowledge. Where the French had attempted a sea-level canal, the Americans would build a more practical lock canal, raising ships up and over the continental divide rather than cutting through it entirely. The American narrative celebrated this success as evidence of national superiority. But the human cost remained. The 5,609 deaths during the American period Added to the 22,000 deaths during the French period, totaled 27,609 lives lost. The engineering triumph was built on a foundation of human suffering, exploitation, and death. The workers who dug the canal, whether they died of yellow fever in the 1880s or malaria in the 1900s, were expendable in the pursuit of a larger vision. And that vision was realized. The canal would be completed in 1914, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, reshaping global trade and naval strategy for a century to come. But the path to that achievement was paved with French financial ruin, Colombian territorial loss, Panamanian sovereignty compromised, and the lives of 27,000 men extinguished in the tropical heat. As we move forward in this history, let us remember that great achievements often come at great cost. The canal exists. Ships transit through it daily. But the names of those who made it possible, the French laborers who died in the first attempt, the West Indian workers who completed the second, the Colombian soldiers who could not prevent their nation's loss, the Panamanian patriots who traded one form of dependence for another, these names are largely forgotten. Before the canal could be completed, a mystery had to be solved. A medical mystery that had plagued humanity for centuries, that had killed hundreds of thousands, and that had stopped the French effort in Panama in its tracks. The mystery of yellow fever. Yellow fever was known by many names. Yellow Jack, Black Vomit, the Bronze John. The names reflected the terror it inspired. The disease struck suddenly, progressing from fever and muscle pain to jaundice, the yellowing of the skin that gave the disease its name, and in severe cases, to hemorrhagic symptoms and death. The mortality rate varied, but in epidemic outbreaks, it could reach 50% or higher, and no one knew what caused it or how it spread. For centuries, physicians had theorized about the origin of epidemic diseases. The dominant theory was miasma, the belief that diseases arose from bad air, from the noxious vapors of decaying organic matter, from the foul-smelling exhalations of swamps and refuse. This theory shaped medical practice and public health measures throughout the 19th century. Cities improved sanitation, removed garbage, cleaned streets, all in an effort to eliminate the sources of bad air. But these measures, while beneficial for other reasons, did not stop yellow fever. The disease continued to strike, seemingly at random, affecting some individuals while sparing others in the same household. The pattern of transmission remained mysterious. In Havana, Cuba, a physician named Carlos Juan Finley began to question the miasma theory. Finley was born in 1833 in Camagüey, Cuba, to a Scottish father and a French mother. He received his medical education in France and the United States, studying at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He returned to Cuba to practice medicine, and over the years he treated numerous cases of yellow fever during the recurring epidemics that swept through Havana. Finley observed the patterns of yellow fever transmission with a careful, systematic attention. He noted that the disease did not spread through direct contact with infected individuals. He noted that it occurred primarily in warm, humid environments. He noted that it seemed to peak during certain seasons. And he began to suspect that an intermediary agent was involved, something that carried the disease from person to person without itself becoming ill. In 1881, Finley presented a paper to the Royal Academy of Medical, Physical, and Natural Sciences in Havana. In this paper, he proposed a revolutionary theory that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, specifically by the species now known as Aedes aegypti. He argued that mosquitoes fed on the blood of infected individuals contracted the virus and then transmitted it to healthy individuals through subsequent bites. The theory was met with skepticism, even dismissal. The idea that a tiny insect could be responsible for such a devastating disease seemed implausible to many of Finley's contemporaries. Mosquitoes were ubiquitous in tropical climates. If they transmitted yellow fever, why didn't everyone who was bitten contract the disease? The mechanism was not understood, and without a clear mechanism, the theory remained speculative. But Finley was persistent. He conducted experiments to test his hypothesis. He allowed mosquitoes to feed on patients who were suffering from yellow fever, and then he allowed those same mosquitoes to bite healthy volunteers. The results of these early experiments were mixed. Some volunteers contracted yellow fever, but others did not. Finley could not explain the inconsistency, and this weakened his case in the eyes of the medical establishment. What Finley did not understand, what no one understood at the time, was the complexity of the viral transmission cycle. The yellow fever virus requires a period of replication within the mosquito before it can be transmitted to a new host. This is called the extrinsic incubation period. If a mosquito bites an infected person and then immediately bites a healthy person, transmission does not occur. The virus must first replicate within the mosquito's body, a process that takes approximately 10 to 12 days in tropical temperatures. Only after this period can the mosquito transmit the virus through its bite. Finlay's experiments, conducted without knowledge of this incubation period, produced inconsistent results because he did not always allow sufficient time between the mosquito's feeding on an infected patient and its feeding on a healthy volunteer. But despite this limitation, his core insight was correct. Mosquitoes were the vector of yellow fever transmission. For nearly 20 years, Finley continued to publish papers on his mosquito theory, refining his arguments, presenting additional evidence. He sent copies of his publications to medical researchers around the world. He shared samples of mosquito eggs with anyone who expressed interest in testing his hypothesis. And gradually, his ideas began to gain attention, if not yet acceptance. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. The Spanish-American War was brief, lasting only a few months, but it resulted in American occupation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. American military forces stationed in Cuba encountered yellow fever, and the disease took a heavy toll. The U.S. Army recognized that controlling yellow fever was essential if American forces were to remain in Cuba for any extended period. In May 1900, Surgeon General George M. Sternberg commissioned a board of Army research scientists to investigate yellow fever. The board was led by Major Walter Reed, an Army physician with experience in bacteriology and infectious disease research. The other members of the commission were James Carroll, Jesse Lazier, and Aristides Agramonte, all of whom were Army physicians with medical expertise relevant to the investigation. The Walter Reed Commission, as it came to be known, began its work in Havana in June 1900. Reed and his colleagues reviewed the existing literature on yellow fever. They examined the various theories of transmission, and they consulted with Carlos Finley, who generously shared his research, his publications, and samples of Aedes aegypti mosquito eggs. The commission decided to conduct a series of controlled experiments to test the mosquito transmission theory. But there was a significant problem. Yellow fever could not be induced in animals. All previous attempts to infect laboratory animals with yellow fever had failed. The disease appeared to affect only humans, and this meant that testing the transmission theory would require human subjects. The ethical implications were profound. The commission would be deliberately exposing human beings to a potentially fatal disease. Walter Reed understood the gravity of this decision. In July 1900, he informed Surgeon General Sternberg that human subject testing was the only option, and Reed determined that the commission members themselves would be among those exposed to the risk. As Reed later explained, the serious nature of the work was decided upon. The risks were fully considered, and all agreed that the best justification they could offer for experimentation on others was to submit to the same risk of inoculation themselves. Jesse Lazier, one of the commission members, volunteered to be bitten by mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients. On September 13, 1900, Lazier was bitten and contracted the disease. He became severely ill, and on September 25, 1900, he died. His death was a sobering reminder of the danger the experiments posed. But the commission continued its work. Reed sought volunteers from the Spanish immigrant community in Cuba, individuals who had not yet been exposed to yellow fever and thus had no immunity. Reed was explicit about the ethical requirements. He asked the Governor General of Cuba, Brigadier General Leonard Wood, to seek approval from the Spanish consul. He wanted to ensure that volunteers would be of legal maturity, at least 25 years old, and that they would understand the risks. He wanted them to know they would be provided with the best medical care available, and he wanted their informed consent. Reed drafted what are now recognized as among the oldest extant informed consent documents in medical research history. The documents were typewritten in both English and Spanish. They took the form of a contract between the individual volunteer and the commission, represented by Reed. Each volunteer explicitly consented to participate. The document explained the nature of the experiment, the risks involved, and the compensation offered. The compensation was substantial. Volunteers would receive $100 in American gold for their participation. If they contracted yellow fever as a result of the experiments, they would receive an additional $100. In 1900, this was a significant sum of money, representing several months' wages for a laborer. The payment was intended to compensate volunteers for the risk they were undertaking and to provide financial support during their recovery if they became ill. The experiments were conducted at a facility called Camp Lazier, established in November 1900 and named in honor of the commission member who had died. The camp was located in the countryside outside Havana, away from potential sources of natural yellow fever infection. The goal was to create a controlled environment where transmission could be studied systematically. The experiments followed a careful protocol. Mosquitoes were allowed to feed on patients who were in the early stages of yellow fever infection, when the virus was present in their blood. The mosquitoes were then kept in captivity for a period of time, the extrinsic incubation period that Finley had not understood, and then the mosquitoes were allowed to bite healthy volunteers. The results were dramatic and conclusive. Volunteers who were bitten by infected mosquitoes contracted yellow fever. 22 volunteers in total came down with the disease, though fortunately all recovered. Volunteers who were exposed to the clothing and bedding of yellow fever patients, but not bitten by mosquitoes, did not contract the disease. This demonstrated that the disease was not spread through contact with contaminated objects, a common belief at the time. In February 1901, the Commission published its findings. The report confirmed that yellow fever was transmitted by the bite of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. The mosquito theory, first proposed by Carlos Finley in 1881, was now validated by rigorous scientific experimentation. The implications for public health were immediate and profound. If yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, then controlling mosquito populations could prevent the disease. And this is precisely what William Crawford Gorgas set out to do in Havana. Gorgas, as we have seen, was appointed Chief Sanitary Officer in Havana in 1898. Following the Reed Commission's findings in 1901, he implemented a comprehensive campaign to eliminate Aedes aegypti from the city. The campaign was aggressive and systematic. On March 1, 1901, martial law was declared with regard to mosquito control measures. All residents of Havana were classified as either immune, those who had previously contracted yellow fever and survived, or non-immune. Non-immune individuals were subject to special regulations designed to protect them from mosquito bites. Gorgas's team searched every building in Havana for mosquito breeding sites. Standing water was eliminated wherever possible. Containers that could not be emptied were covered with oil to kill mosquito larvae. Buildings where yellow fever cases were identified were fumigated with sulfur or pyrethrum to kill adult mosquitoes. The fumigation procedure was specific and deliberate. Pans containing the appropriate quantity of powder 2 pounds per 1,000 cubic feet were placed in sealed rooms, sprinkled with wood alcohol, and set alight. The results were astonishing. Between 1890 and 1900, Havana had experienced an annual average of 462 yellow fever deaths. In January and February 1901, following the initiation of Gorges's mosquito elimination campaign, only 12 deaths were recorded. The last death from yellow fever during the American occupation of Cuba occurred on September 28, 1901. By January 1903, Gorges reported to the United States Senate that Cuba remained free of yellow fever, accomplishing the previously established 18-month benchmark for evidence of eradication. The conquest of yellow fever in Havana was a triumph of public health. A disease that had killed hundreds of people every year was effectively eliminated within months through targeted mosquito control measures. The success validated both Finley's theory and the Reed Commission's experimental proof, and it demonstrated that tropical diseases could be controlled through scientific understanding and systematic intervention. When construction of the Panama Canal began under American direction in 1904, William Gorges was appointed as Chief Sanitary Officer of the Canal Zone. He brought with him the knowledge and experience gained in Havana, and he implemented the same mosquito control measures on a much larger scale across the entire Canal Zone. The sanitation campaign in Panama was even more ambitious than the effort in Havana. The Canal Zone covered a much larger area, much of it jungle and swampland that provided ideal mosquito habitat. Gorges divided the zone into districts, each with its own team of inspectors. Every building was inspected regularly for mosquito larvae. Approximately 700,000 gallons of oil and 124,000 gallons of larvicide were used over the course of the construction project. Ponds and swamps were drained. Public water systems were constructed to eliminate the need for water storage in open containers. And it worked. Yellow fever, which had killed thousands of French workers in the 1880s, was effectively eliminated from the Canal Zone by 1906. The disease that had made Panama synonymous with death was conquered through the application of medical knowledge gained from Finley's observations, Reed's experiments, and Gorges's systematic implementation. But this triumph was not without its complexities and ethical ambiguities. The informed consent documents created by Walter Reed represented a significant advance in medical ethics. They acknowledged that research subjects had rights, that they deserved to understand the risks they were undertaking, and that they should be compensated for those risks. This was a meaningful step toward the ethical frameworks that govern medical research today. Yet the consent process was not without problems. The volunteers were offered substantial financial compensation at a time and in a place where economic opportunities were limited. This raises questions about the extent to which consent was truly voluntary. When a man is offered $200 several months' wages to participate in a medical experiment, and when that man is living in poverty under military occupation, can his consent be considered freely given? Or is it, to some degree, coerced by economic desperation? Additionally, the consent documents made no mention of compensation in the event of death. While all volunteers in the Reed Commission experiments fortunately survived, Jesse Lazier had died from experimental exposure earlier in the process. The possibility of death was real, and the absence of provisions for the families of volunteers who might die represents a significant ethical gap. And there is the broader context to consider. The medical breakthroughs that made the Panama Canal possible were achieved in the context of American imperialism and military occupation. The Reed Commission operated in Cuba under American military rule. Gorges's campaigns in both Havana and Panama were conducted with the authority and resources of an occupying power. The knowledge gained benefited colonial and imperial projects. Tropical medicine as a discipline emerged in close association with European and American colonial expansion. The London School of Tropical Medicine was founded in 1899, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine the same year, both with the explicit goal of protecting colonial administrators, soldiers, and settlers from tropical diseases. The focus was on making colonization safer for Europeans, not on improving health outcomes for colonized populations. The study of malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases was pursued primarily because these diseases posed obstacles to colonial exploitation. The diseases killed European colonizers. They made it difficult to maintain colonial administrations and military garrisons. They threatened the profitability of colonial enterprises. And so resources were devoted to understanding and controlling these diseases, but the primary beneficiaries were the colonial powers themselves. The indigenous and colonized populations often received little benefit from tropical medicine research. The health of native populations was largely ignored unless their illness threatened colonial economic interests by reducing the available labor force. The social factors that contributed to disease, poverty, malnutrition, exploitative work conditions were rarely addressed. In Panama, the mosquito control measures implemented by Gorgas saved lives. This is undeniable. The reduction in yellow fever and malaria deaths was a genuine public health achievement. But it is also true that the measures were implemented to serve American strategic interests. The Canal was an American project. The workers whose lives were saved so that they could continue to dig. The conquest of tropical disease was inseparable from the larger project of imperial expansion. Carlos Finlay, the Cuban physician whose theory made it all possible, is often erased from the historical narrative. In many popular accounts of the Panama Canal, Walter Reed receives credit for discovering that mosquitoes transmit yellow fever. Finlay's name is mentioned, if at all, as a minor footnote. The collaborative nature of the achievement, Finlay's insight, Reed's experimental validation, Gorgas's implementation, is obscured by a narrative that centers American contributions and marginalizes Cuban ones. This erasure reflects broader patterns in the history of science and medicine. The contributions of researchers from colonized or non-Western societies are frequently minimized or forgotten. Credit is assigned to Western researchers, often military or government officials, whose work built upon foundations laid by others. Finlay lived to see his theory validated and yellow fever controlled in Cuba and Panama. He was nominated 7 times for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, but never received it. He died in 1915, at the age of 81, in Havana. Today, he is remembered and honored in Cuba, where his contributions are celebrated. But in the broader international narrative of the Panama Canal, his role remains understated. The conquest of yellow fever was a genuine scientific achievement. It demonstrated the power of systematic observation, experimental testing, and practical application of scientific knowledge. It saved lives. It made possible one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the modern era. But it was also an achievement embedded in the politics and inequalities of its time. An achievement pursued in service of imperial ambitions. An achievement whose benefits were distributed unequally. As you drift toward sleep, you might reflect on the complexity of progress, on the fact that scientific knowledge can be both liberating and exploitative, that the same measures that save lives can serve imperialism, that heroes and villains are rarely so clearly distinguished in history. Finlay, Reed, Gorgas all made contributions. But those contributions existed within systems of power, occupation, and inequality. The mosquito, tiny and seemingly insignificant, proved to be the key to a mystery that had haunted humanity for centuries. And the conquest of that tiny insect opened the path for ships to sail between 2 oceans. Rest now. Let these thoughts settle. The story continues, but for now, simply let yourself be still. The canal was completed in the summer of 1914. On August 15th, the cargo ship SS Ancon made the first official transit through the waterway, traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a journey of approximately 40 miles that took 10 hours. The passage was ceremonial, symbolic, a demonstration that the dream was now reality. 2 oceans had been connected. The geography of global commerce and naval power had been fundamentally altered. But the opening received little international attention. The world was distracted. On August 4th, 1914, just 11 days before the canal opened, Britain had declared war on Germany. The First World War had begun. The newspapers that might have devoted front pages to the engineering triumph instead focused on mobilizations, invasions, and the beginning of what would become the deadliest conflict in human history to that point. The canal, built over a decade at enormous human and financial cost, opened quietly, overshadowed by war. Yet the strategic significance of the canal was immediately apparent to those who understood naval power. The waterway represented a transformation in how the United States could project military force across both of its oceanic frontiers. Consider the basic geography. Before the canal, a ship traveling from New York to San Francisco had to navigate around the southern tip of South America through the treacherous waters of Cape Horn. This voyage covered approximately 13,000 nautical miles and could take months, depending on weather and vessel speed. The route was dangerous. The waters around Cape Horn were notorious for storms, strong currents, and unpredictable conditions. Ships were lost. Crews perished. The Panama Canal reduced this journey to approximately 5,000 nautical miles. The distance was cut by more than half. A voyage that might have taken 2 months now took 2 weeks. In practical terms, this meant that the United States possessed, for the first time, the ability to rapidly move naval forces between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The military implications were profound. The United States had interests in both oceans. On the Atlantic side, there were traditional ties to Europe, trade relationships, and potential threats from European naval powers. On the Pacific side, there were growing interests in Asia, territorial possessions in the Philippines and Hawaii, and increasing tension with Japan. Prior to the canal, defending these interests required maintaining 2 separate fleets, one stationed in each ocean. This was inefficient and expensive. The United States did not have the industrial capacity or financial resources to build and maintain 2 fully capable fleets simultaneously. The two-ocean standard, as it was called, required that the Atlantic Fleet be strong enough to defend Atlantic interests, and that the Pacific Fleet be strong enough to defend Pacific interests, with no expectation that either fleet could reinforce the other in a timely manner. The canal changed this calculation entirely. With rapid transit between oceans now possible, the United States could maintain a single integrated fleet that could be deployed to whichever ocean required reinforcement. If a crisis emerged in the Pacific, ships from the Atlantic could transit through the canal and arrive in weeks rather than months. The strategic flexibility this provided was unprecedented. Naval planners recognized this immediately. Articles published in the United States Naval Institute, proceedings in 1913 before the canal even opened, discussed the implications for fleet structure and deployment. The canal meant that the total strength of the Navy could be reduced because forces could be concentrated where needed rather than permanently divided. It meant that in the event of war, the United States could mass its naval power in a single theater with far greater speed than any potential adversary. This advantage would prove critical in the decades that followed. During World War II, the Panama Canal enabled the United States to shift naval assets between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters as the strategic situation demanded. During the Cold War, the canal remained a vital element of American military logistics. And even today, in the context of renewed great power competition, the canal's strategic value is recognized and debated. But naval mobility was only one aspect of the canal's strategic significance. The waterway also represented a permanent American military presence in the heart of Central America. The Canal Zone, as we have seen, was granted to the United States in perpetuity under the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty. The zone was a strip of land 10 miles wide, extending 5 miles on either side of the canal itself. Within this zone, the United States exercised governmental authority. American law applied, American officials administered, and most importantly, American military forces were stationed permanently. The fortifications began immediately. Even before the canal opened, The U.S. War Department was planning and constructing coastal artillery installations to defend the waterway from naval attack. By June 1915, almost $15 million had been spent on fortifying the canal, including the locks and dams. Military reservations were officially designated on September 18, 1917, as Fort Grant, Fort Amador, Fort Sherman, Fort Randolph, and Fort de Lesseps. These were not small installations. Fort Grant and Fort Amador, located at the Pacific entrance to the canal, were constructed between 1914 and 1917 as the principal coastal artillery fortifications for defending that approach. They included massive gun emplacements, some mounting 16-inch rifles capable of engaging enemy warships at extreme range. The construction required extensive grading of terrain, building of roads, installation of water and sewer systems, construction of barracks, officers' quarters, headquarters buildings, and all the infrastructure necessary for a permanent military garrison. Fort Sherman, Fort Randolph, and Fort de Lesseps defended the Atlantic entrance. These installations similarly included coastal artillery batteries, searchlight positions, ammunition magazines, and supporting infrastructure. Forts Randolph and de Lesseps functioned as the harbor defenses of Cristobal from 1912 through 1948, part of the United States Army Coast Artillery Corps. In addition to coastal defenses, the Canal Zone became home to air bases, training facilities, and administrative centers. Fort Dillon housed the School of the Americas, a U.S. military training facility that trained Latin American military and police personnel. Fort Davis and Franceville provided additional military infrastructure. The zone became, in effect, a major American military base, occupying the geographic center of the Western Hemisphere. This permanent military presence served multiple purposes. Obviously, it protected the canal itself from potential attack, but it also projected American power throughout the Caribbean and Central America. The presence of American forces in Panama meant that the United States could intervene rapidly anywhere in the region. It was a statement, physical and unmistakable, of American dominance, and it was made possible by the engineering marvel of the locks themselves. The lock system was the key technical innovation that made the Panama Canal feasible. The French had attempted to build a sea-level canal, cutting through the continental divide at ground level. This approach required excavating to a depth that proved geologically impractical. The Americans, under the direction of Chief Engineer John Stevens and later George Washington Goethals, adopted a different strategy, a lock canal that would lift ships up and over the divide. The principle was straightforward. Ships entering the canal from either ocean would be raised approximately 85 feet above sea level through a series of locks, traverse an artificial lake, Gatun Lake, at that elevated level, and then be lowered back down to sea level on the opposite side. The execution was anything but straightforward. The locks are among the most impressive engineering structures ever built. There are 3 sets of locks on the canal. Gatun locks, on the Atlantic side, consist of 3 steps or chambers that raise ships from sea level to the elevation of Gatun Lake. Pedro Miguel locks, on the Pacific side, have 1 step that lowers ships partway, and Miraflores locks have 2 steps that complete the descent to Pacific sea level. Each lock chamber is enormous. The original locks were 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, and could accommodate ships of substantial size. The construction required pouring millions of cubic yards of concrete, installing massive steel gates that could withstand enormous water pressure, and creating a system of valves and culverts to fill and empty the chambers with controlled precision. At the time of their construction, the locks surpassed any similar existing structures in their overall mass, dimensions, and innovative design. They were called the structural triumph of the Panama Canal, and they remain, to this day, considered an engineering wonder of the world. The lock system worked by gravity. Water flowed from Gatun Lake, a massive artificial reservoir created by damming the Chagres River down through the locks, raising or lowering ships as needed. No pumps were required. The system was elegant, efficient, and reliable. But the locks also embodied a particular vision of progress and control. They represented the triumph of human engineering over natural geography. They demonstrated that nature could be reshaped, that obstacles could be overcome through technical ingenuity and industrial capacity. And they reflected the confidence, some might say arrogance, of an era that believed in the unlimited potential of modern civilization. This was the progressive era in American history, a period characterized by faith in scientific management, technological solutions, and the perfectibility of society through rational planning. The Panama Canal was the apotheosis of these beliefs. It was a problem solved through engineering, a landscape remade through human effort, a monument to modernity. But this progressive vision was inseparable from less admirable ideologies. The same era that celebrated technological progress also embraced racial hierarchies, eugenics, and imperial expansion. The belief that the United States had the right, even the duty, to control the Canal Zone, to reshape Panama's geography, to project power throughout the Western Hemisphere, was justified by theories of racial superiority and manifest destiny. The Canal Zone became a landscape of American imperialism. The architecture, the urban planning, the social organization all reflected American ideals and American prejudices. The zone was segregated, with white American employees living in comfortable housing with modern amenities, while black West Indian workers lived in inferior conditions. This segregation was not accidental. It was designed, deliberate, a spatial manifestation of the racial ideology that underpinned the entire project. Environmental determinism, a concept in early 20th century geography, claimed that the environment in which people lived predetermined their capacity for intelligence, civilization, and labor. This pseudoscientific theory was used to justify the privileged status of white Americans in the Canal Zone. The argument went that people of European descent were naturally suited to leadership and administration, while tropical peoples were naturally suited to manual labor. The gold roll and silver roll wage system, the segregated housing, the separate schools, all were rationalized by these supposed scientific principles. The Panama Canal, in this context, was more than an engineering project. It was an expression of a worldview that saw technological progress and racial hierarchy as complementary rather than contradictory, a worldview that celebrated conquest of nature, conquest of disease, conquest of geography, without acknowledging the human cost or the moral ambiguities involved. And the canal reshaped the world. The impact on global trade was immediate and enormous. Shipping routes that had existed for centuries were abandoned. New patterns of commerce emerged. The canal became one of the most important choke points in the global economy, a narrow waterway through which 15,000 ships transit annually, carrying hundreds of millions of tons of cargo. The economic benefits accrued primarily to those who controlled the canal. During the decades of American control, the United States collected tolls, regulated traffic, and ensured that the waterway served American strategic interests. Panama received the annual rental fee specified in the treaty $250,000. Later increased, but the real economic and strategic value of the canal remained in American hands. This remained the case until 1977, when President Jimmy Carter negotiated the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, which provided for the gradual transfer of the Canal Zone to Panamanian control, culminating in full Panamanian sovereignty over the canal on December 31, 1999. The treaties were controversial in the United States, with critics arguing that the canal was too strategically important to relinquish. But the treaties were ratified, and the transfer occurred as scheduled. Today, the canal is operated by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous agency of the Panamanian government. The United States no longer maintains military bases in the former Canal Zone. The forts have been decommissioned, the installations dismantled or repurposed. The era of American control is over. But the legacy remains. The canal exists. Ships still transit between the oceans, carrying the commerce of the world. The strategic calculations of naval planners still account for the ability to move forces rapidly between Atlantic and Pacific. The geography of global trade still reflects the shortcut carved through Panama more than a century ago. And the human cost remains part of the story. 27,000 workers died during the French and American construction efforts. Tens of thousands more suffered illness, injury, and exploitation. The West Indian laborers who built the canal received minimal recognition, minimal compensation, and were subject to systematic discrimination throughout their time in the canal zone. The progressive era ideology that built the canal, combining technological optimism, racial hierarchy, and imperial expansion, has been discredited. We recognize now that scientific progress does not justify exploitation, that engineering triumphs do not erase human suffering, that the conquest of nature comes with ecological and social costs that must be acknowledged. But the canal remains a monument to human ambition, a testament to engineering ingenuity, and a reminder of the costs of progress measured in lives lost, landscapes transformed, and sovereignty compromised. As you drift toward sleep, consider the complexity of legacy. The canal serves the world. It facilitates trade. It connects nations. But it was built through imperialism, through exploitation, through the labor of men who had few other choices. It represents both the best and the worst of the early 20th century, both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human indifference to suffering. The locks still lift ships 85 feet above sea level. The water still flows from Gatun Lake. The channel still cuts through the mountains. And somewhere in the archives are the names of the 27,000 who died to make it possible. Most of those names will never be spoken again, but their labor remains, embedded in every transit, every journey between the oceans. Rest now. The story is complete. Let the past recede. Let the present comfort you. The canal exists, connecting two great oceans. And you are here, safe and still, drifting gently toward sleep. And so we reach the end of our journey through the history of the Panama Canal. A journey that has taken us from the labor camps where West Indian workers woke before dawn to the boardrooms where French investors lost their fortunes, to the laboratories where medical researchers solved the mystery of yellow fever, to the strategic planning rooms where naval officers calculated the projection of American power across two oceans. We have walked through heat and rain. We have witnessed the Culebra cut carved into the continental divide, ton by ton, through dynamite and steam shovels and the endless labor of human hands. We have stood beside men stricken with disease, their bodies burning with fever, their skin yellowing with jaundice, their lives ending far from home in service to a vision that was never their own. We have seen empires rise and fall, French confidence transformed into French scandal, Colombian sovereignty challenged by American gunboat diplomacy, Panamanian independence achieved with American support, followed immediately by Panamanian sovereignty compromised through perpetual American control of the canal zone. We have traced the scientific breakthrough that made the canal possible, Carlos Finley's patient observation, Walter Reed's experimental validation, William Gorgas's systematic implementation, the conquest of yellow fever and the control of malaria, the transformation of medical understanding, the birth of tropical medicine as a discipline, forever entangled with the imperial projects it served. And we have examined the strategic consequences, the locks that lift ships 85 feet above sea level, the artificial lake that floods what was once jungle and valley, the reduction of voyages by thousands of miles, the projection of naval power, the reshaping of global trade routes, the permanent military presence in the heart of Central America. All of this, the engineering, the medicine, the politics, the strategy rests on a foundation of human labor and human sacrifice. 27,000 deaths. Hundreds of thousands of workers who survived but carried the marks of their service-damaged lungs from dynamite dust, recurring bouts of malaria, injuries from accidents, memories of friends buried in the jungle. The canal is a triumph. This cannot be denied. It is one of the great engineering achievements of human history. It demonstrates what can be accomplished through planning, resources, determination, and the application of scientific knowledge. Ships transit daily between the Atlantic and Pacific. Global commerce flows through this narrow channel. The dream of connecting two oceans became reality. But triumphs are complex. They are never pure. The same canal that facilitates trade was built through exploitation. The same medical breakthroughs that saved lives served imperial expansion. The same engineering marvels that inspire awe required the labor of men who were paid half wages, housed in inadequate camps, subjected to systematic discrimination, and exposed to dangers that killed them by the thousands. History does not offer simple lessons. It offers complexities, contradictions, uncomfortable truths. The canal is both monument and graveyard, both connection and division, both achievement and exploitation. Tonight, as you lie in comfort and safety, in a time and place far removed from the jungles of Panama in 1907, you might reflect on the distance between your present and that past. You do not wake before dawn to 10 hours of excavation in tropical heat. You do not face the daily possibility of contracting yellow fever. You do not live under a wage system that pays you half what others receive for identical work. You are not digging through mountains with the knowledge that your labor enriches distant powers while you struggle merely to survive. This distance is profound, and it is the gift of time, of circumstance, of living in an era when such exploitation is recognized and condemned rather than celebrated and justified. But the canal remains, and it reminds us that the world we inhabit was built in part through such exploitation. The infrastructure of modernity, the shipping routes, the trade networks, the strategic calculations, rests on foundations laid by people whose names we do not know, whose suffering we can only imagine, whose contributions have been largely forgotten in the grand narratives of progress and achievement. The 27,000 who died building the Panama Canal deserved better. They deserved fair wages, safe working conditions, adequate medical care, recognition of their humanity and their contributions. They did not receive these things. History does not always provide justice, but we can, at least, remember. We can acknowledge. We can recognize that the monuments of our world were built by people who suffered, who sacrificed, who died. And perhaps that recognition is what we carry forward. Not the simplistic celebration of achievement, not the uncritical admiration of engineering marvels, but a more nuanced understanding, an appreciation for what was accomplished, yes, but also an acknowledgement of what it cost and who paid the price. The canal connects two oceans, and in doing so, it connects us to a past that is both inspiring and troubling, a past that demonstrates human capacity for ingenuity and for cruelty, for solving problems and for exploiting the vulnerable, for building monuments and for forgetting the builders. As you drift into sleep, let these thoughts settle gently. Let the images fade: the Culebra Cut, the fumigation teams, the locked chambers, the ships in transit. Let the names recede: Lesseps, Roosevelt, Finley, Reed, Gorgas, and the 27,000 whose names we never learned. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are here in the present, while the past becomes memory, becomes history, becomes story. The canal exists, spanning the Isthmus of Panama, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. The water flows through the locks. The ships make their transits. And somewhere in the record are the traces of those who made it possible. Rest now. Sleep peacefully. The history is told. The story is complete. And you can let it all go, drifting gently into the quiet darkness where all stories eventually lead. Good night.